Hello everybody, my name is Jacob Reynolds. Welcome to this session on what is democracy. We've got a fantastic panel here to help sort of probe that question. Obviously, I think, especially in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, it's really thrown into sharp relief this question of really what democracy is and why it might be valuable. We're hearing an awful lot more about the implications of allowing anybody really to have had a say in the Brexit debate, and heard a lot about how that has really led to all kinds of chaos and people who had no idea what they were talking about being able to vote. So this whole question has really been thrown into sharp relief. Obviously, it's nothing new since the sort of inception of Western philosophy, or Western political philosophy with Plato. There's been this sort of constant discussion about whether democracy is valuable, what kind of political government we might need. And again, over recent years, we've seen this reinvigoration on this debate, in part because of sort of new technologies and network thinking that seems that maybe even some of the old ideas about Athenian democracy, direct democracy, might not actually be impossible as it was always assumed for modern societies, given the opportunities afforded by the internet. But all of this really has taken place, at least for me, I think, without a huge understanding at the intellectual level of what democracy is and why it might be valuable. So I've got a really fantastic panel here to help us think through that question. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. So first, here, just on the end of the table, but not at the far end, is Carne. He's the author of a great book, Leaderless Revolution. He's also the executive director of the Independent Diplomat. Speaking next, on my immediate right, we've got Ali Miraj, who's a social entrepreneur, DJ, political activist, financier, and founder of the Contrarian Prize, so sort of all-round great guy. Then speaking on my immediate left, Rachel Hammersley, who's a senior lecturer in intellectual history at Newcastle University. She's author of the English Republican Tradition and 18th Century France, and is editor of Revolutionary Moments, Reading Revolutionary Texts, so obviously key to this discussion. Then speaking last, on my far left, probably the only time when people get introduced like that is actually probably appropriate. He's the editor-at-large of Spiked. He's the author of Revolting, How the Establishment Are Undermining Democracy and What They're Afraid Of, and Trigger Warning, Is the Fear of Being Offensive Killing Free Speech? I'm just going to hand over to Carne now to kick us off.
Sure, I got the mug slot, not of my own volition, but anyway, greetings everybody. I used to believe in representative democracy and the market system. I was a British diplomat representing those ideas to the world. I no longer believe them. One reason is I saw my own government lie about a war and ignore alternatives to war, and the people who perpetrated this crime have not been held accountable, and still indeed are invited to events like this to offer their opinions about current events. But my own personal experience is not sufficiently compelling on its own. I would encourage you to look at the evidence of what's going on with the current system, the outputs. If you see democracy, capitalism as an input-output machine, what are the outputs empirically? And I don't mean what we see, what passes for politics, the playground antics of the current cabinet. I mean the actual things that matter to society. Inequality getting worse, climate getting worse, the Paris Agreement, the combined commitments of 192 member states of the United Nations on current estimates will not keep the world's temperature beneath 3.5 degrees centigrade by 2100. Political violence has metastasized and proliferated to an epic extent across the world since the day I heard an aircraft fly over my head into the World Trade Center in New York City. And as we now have political violence in concert halls in Paris, and the Middle East is aflame from Tripoli to Aleppo, from Yemen to southern Turkey. And underneath all of this, there is some kind of deep existential crisis, which one might call a sense of lack of agency. that people feel that they have lost control over their own affairs. An extreme example of this is, of course, the great tragedy of Grenfell Tower in our own city. Does anybody truly believe that the people who died in Grenfell Tower would be dead today had they had control over their own circumstances and how their own building was managed? This lack of agency costs lives. But it's also manifested in other ways in the rather aberrational political phenomena we're seeing today, whether Brexit, the election of Trump, the rise of petty nationalism, etc., phenomena with which we're all familiar. What is the answer to these crises? Because I don't think they're just a crisis of democracy. Power and social justice is about two elements. It's about the nature of political life, and it's also about the nature of the economy. You can't address one without addressing the other. So I would suggest that we need to create a society which is more economically equal, where resources are shared and where the benefits of enterprise are shared amongst those who contribute to those enterprises. And by that I don't mean tax. I don't think higher tax regimes, as offered by some, suggested by some, will bring justice. They are in themselves coercive, and they won't address the fundamental problems of an economy transforming as we speak from a 20th century model to one dominated by automation, roboticization, an aging population, etc. We have to build equality and sharing into the economic model itself, the nature of the company. Cooperatives, triple bottom line companies where the environmental and social outcomes of economic activity are given at least as great a weight as mere profit. The second thing, the political. You cannot have the government for the people when it is not by them or of them. I would propose a simple return to an Athenian model of democracy where ordinary citizens take part in taking decisions about their own affairs. You can call this many things. You can call it communalism. You can call it participatory democracy. This is not utopian or idealistic. It works. It has worked in large cities in Brazil where participatory processes have produced much more equal outcomes in terms of the distribution of resources in a city. And I've seen it myself work in a remarkable corner of northeast Syria called Rojava, where a bottom-up project of government, of democratic government, shared by all ethnicities, where women and men are very deliberately held equal. It is producing stability and democracy in the most adverse of circumstances. So reform is plausible. It is not idealistic, and I would suggest that it is radically urgent. Thank you.
Cheers, Carne. Thanks so much. Great, that's a great start to kick us off. I'm now going to turn to Ali for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Jacob. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here as always. What is democracy? Well, I'm minded of a trip I took to Vilnius earlier this year to the KGB Museum. And as I walked down the steps into the basement of that building, I began to read on the walls of the prison the statements of the political prisoners that had been interned, tortured and killed there. And it was a sobering thought to believe and to reflect on the fact that they had lost their lives for speaking up for the values they held dear and what they believed in. And if democracy is anything, it is the ability to challenge the status quo and to speak your mind and to speak out. Now, sadly, that is not the case, or that whole philosophy is under pressure. The tectonic plates of global politics are shifting. Brexit, Trump, the rise of the Freedom Party in Austria, the rise of the AfD in Germany, Wilders in the Netherlands, Le Pen in France temporarily halted. If Macron messes up, maybe not so. The seeds of discontent are there and are visible. And there are three reasons, in my view, why we are at this juncture, why we have arrived here. Groupthink, the hubris of the elite, and the closing down of debate. Let me just take each in turn quickly. Now, on groupthink, you just have to think about the fact that decisions of pivotal importance to this country are made by a few individuals sitting on sofas, sofa government. Ken's already mentioned the absolutely disastrous decision to go to war in Iraq, which cost thousands of lives. We could also talk about Blair's decision in 2003 to not impose transitional controls, immigration controls with the 8 countries that came into the EU at that time from Eastern Europe, which then sowed the seeds for a lot of the problems we then had. When you have a situation where immigration's 50,000 a year to going up to 260,000 a year, and then 300,000 just before the Brexit referendum, and immigration remains one of the top 2 political issues for a decade before the Brexit vote. Not a big surprise that that was an issue in the referendum. You could talk about groupthink on the part of David Cameron on hosting a referendum, ill thought through, binary question. I mean, I'm a financier. We have higher thresholds in our loan agreements for voting decisions by lenders than simple 50% majority. Right? Then you talk about the hubris of the elite, something that Michael Sandel of Harvard has referred to. It's the kind of, you know, if you live in zone 1 and 2 in London, as I do, that you've drawn the best lot in life, you've drawn the ace card. So, you know, these illiterate, great unwashed who live beyond the M25, who are frankly thick and hang around in pubs, you know, talking about immigration and other things. How could they have done this to us? Well, you know, it's a bit like the miners, you know, under Thatcher losing their jobs, or the Scots who, you know, wanted independence and didn't get it. Well, politics is done to them too. And in fact, you know, this is how most people in this country feel most of the time. It's just that the political class and the media class are squealing because the shoe's on the other foot now, and they just don't like it. And that's a serious issue. It's a wake-up call for them. So hubris of the elite is a serious issue. And then the final point is really the closing down of debate. And this is happening from universities to the political sphere. Universities, you can't have Germaine Greer invited to go and give a speech in some university in Wales because she made some comment about transgender individuals that students got upset about and were going to no-platform her. You have a situation where Peter Tatchell, of all people, is accused of being transgender phobic, if there is such a term, having spent his whole life campaigning for human rights to the extent that he got beaten up by Robert Mugabe's bodyguards and still lives with the scars today. So you can't have an open discussion without being vilified and have an open debate about anything. You want to talk about immigration, you're just branded as racist. You want to talk about concerns you have about cultural identity, you're branded as non-inclusive. This is really a huge issue. The political and media classes in this country have just been talking to themselves. They operate in the echo chamber of politics where they reinforce each other's views. And let me give you one example. I live in Bethnal Green and Bow. To give you one example, Una King, my MP, some years ago, lost her election. Why did she lose the election? Because she did not listen to her people who were against the Iraq war. She voted for it like a typical lackey who's climbing the greasy pole, and they do. And she got turfed out by the electorate. So the electoral process worked. What was the price she paid for that? To end up in the House of Lords, to then become head of diversity at Channel 4, and now to leave the country and to go and sit on a fat salary in Silicon Valley. So, you know, little wonder that people are, you know, sort of upset about the political class and rewards for failure. I mean, this is how the seeds of revolution are sown. And we've seen several of them, and the Brexit referendum is just one example of it.
Thank you. Great. And Rachel, if you could give us your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for inviting me to speak. So there's evidence that democracy is in crisis, not just in the UK, but also in the USA and across continental Europe. There's been a great deal of discussion around both the diagnosis and the remedy, and some of that was reflected in the blurb and the readings for today's session. So I don't want to go into that now. What I want to do is to argue for a historical approach to this issue. I'm a historian, so I guess that is what I would do. Democracy, as has already been suggested by other panellists, is not a new concept. Institutions of democracy, debates about the advantages, disadvantages of democracy date back to ancient Greek times and possibly beyond. Now, of course, the concept has changed a great deal over that time, and we need to be aware of the fact that it has changed. But I'd still argue that we can actually learn quite a lot from looking at past models and also at past debates. In particular, what I want to do is to argue that we can learn a significant amount if we look back to the 17th and 18th centuries, which might not seem like the obvious place to look when we're thinking about democracy, 17th century in particular. But the reason I want to go back to that period is because it's a period immediately before the time when our modern democratic system, based on parties, elections, majority rule, became firmly entrenched. And so what you see in the 17th and 18th centuries is much more flexibility about what democracy is and much more willingness to experiment, at least in thought, if not always in action. And so I think it's a useful period for us to explore. I've only got limited time, so what I'm going to do is just give you two examples of things that we might think about from that period. The first one actually is an answer to the issue that Ali's raised, the kind of issue of entrenched political elites, if you like, the idea that these are just a small group of people speaking to themselves. The 17th century, there was a concern about the whole question of accountability, of rulers being accountable or of rulers becoming unaccountable. And it was a particular issue for one political thinker, a man called James Harrington, who was the author of The Commonwealth of Oceania, which was published in 1656. Harrington had a rather negative view of human nature. He felt that people cannot be trusted with power. That even those who started out well-intentioned, who seemed to behave virtuously, actually, once they were in power, would become corrupted by it if they were in power for too long. So his solution was a system of rotation of office. You could be elected into power for 3 years. After your 3 years, you had to spend 3 years out of office before being re-elected again. That's, of course, a very different system from the kind that we have in operation today, where somebody like Tam Dalyell could be an MP for 43 years consecutively without ever stepping back out again. Now, Harrington was a Republican writer, but that idea has a longer history and also broader appeal. So it comes originally from Aristotle and his idea that citizens ought to rule and be ruled in turns, and the importance of those people who make the laws actually having to live according to the same laws that they've made. But it was also picked up on and advocated by David Hume in the 18th century, who argued that when you were designing political systems, you needed to assume that all men are knaves. The second issue that I want to touch on is the problem of citizens feeling a lack of engagement with, a lack of ownership of the political process. And I think that arises in part because of the way in which the majority exercises its democratic rights is essentially by voting in representatives. There are some other ways of participating, but that's the main way in which we do it. And this was noted in the 18th century by the Genevan thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued, talking about England, he said the English people think that they're free. Actually, they're only free once every 7 years at that moment that they vote for their candidates. Once they've done that, they're no longer free. Influenced by Rousseau's position, a group of French revolutionaries associated with the radical Cordelier Club in Paris proposed what was a rather innovative system for more direct citizen participation in legislation. So the idea was that legislative proposals would be drawn up by a legislative assembly at the centre of government, but those proposals would then be sent out to local assemblies across the country for ratification, and they would only become law if they were ratified by a majority of those assemblies. And there were possibilities also for having the laws revised, refined, as well as simply for acceptance and rejection. Now, of course, introducing that kind of system for all laws would be incredibly cumbersome. And I'm also very aware that in the light of Brexit and also recent events in Catalonia, people are perhaps even more wary now of referenda than they were before. But new technologies do make such ideas more practical now than they ever have been, and certainly than they were in the 1790s. Now, I'm not suggesting that we introduce these particular ideas. I'm just wanting to suggest that exploring past discussions of democracy, exploring past ideas and models, might give us some new ways of thinking about both the problems of democracy and also potentially solutions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. And to round off the opening remarks, Mick.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon. What is democracy? When George Orwell wrote his brilliant essay, Politics in the English Language, which I assume has been referred to and will be referred to elsewhere in this kind of series of discussions about political language today, he made a very good point about democracy, that he wrote it in 1946, end of the Second World War, everybody's celebrating the triumph of democracy over fascism, and at a time when, before the war, democracy had seemed to be on its last legs. Suddenly it had been revitalised by its victory. And he made the point that whilst everybody then started talking about democracy again in 1946, nobody wanted to talk about what it meant. The point Orwell made was that any attempt to define democracy was resisted from all sides because, as he put it, the defenders of every kind of regime claim it is a democracy. And so the last thing you want is for someone to narrow down a definition of it which might exclude your version of it. And I think 70 years later, we can see that problem of defining democracy and the promiscuous use of the language of democracy to justify all kinds of regimes and political actions on a weekly or even daily basis. You know, the Catalan Parliament declares independence and renounces the Spanish Constitution in the name of democracy. The Spanish government then annuls Catalan autonomy and says it's imposing direct rule in order to restore democracy. When you have in my opinion, a genuine democratic revolt, like the Brexit referendum vote, a genuine democratic revolt against the political elite, those who then want to disrupt or derail it try to do so, again, using the language of democracy, that in order to defend parliamentary democracy, we must somehow derail, slow down, or alter the process of Brexit. So the language of democracy is used to justify whatever your own agenda is. And just looking at the Chinese Communist Party Congress last week, I was reminded that, you know, this is the one-party state which is known as the Chinese People's Democratic Republic, where the official who's in charge of local elections, explaining the limits of democracy in China, said, well, we have 1.8 billion people in China. If we asked all of them to express their opinions, who would we listen to? So that's their justification for a kind of one-party state in the name of the people's democracy. So it's very difficult to define democracy when the language is used in this way to defend whatever you want. And rather than Orwell, perhaps we ought to look to Humpty Dumpty, who we remember in Alice Through the Looking Glass, tells Alice that the word means whatever he decides it means. And when she says, well, surely the question is, can you do that? He says, no, the question is, who is to be master? And whoever is master will define what the language and what the words mean that he chooses to mean. So I want to pick up on the historical, in order to try and cut through that a little bit, pick up on the historical trend. I think it's very important that's been referred to by my fellow speakers, and go kind of back to basics in search of a definition. If we go back to ancient Athens, we will find that the portmanteau word demokratia has two basic constituent parts. Demos, the people, which could mean either all of the people, or those who understand ancient Greek rather better than me will say it could also be referred to mean the lower ranks of the people, the poor, the mass of the poor. Demos, the people, and kratos, meaning power or control. So what democracy means is the merging of those two, the people having power and control. And if we understand that, then we understand what the ruling elites have been so scared of for the last 2,500 years, and why, even in ancient Athens, democracy was a dirty word used to describe mob rule, the kind of filthy masses, a model that was kind of set by Plato, who set the template for all of the anti-democratic criticism that's come since in many ways. when he talked about even the best of politicians simply being no better than pastry chefs because they satisfy the vulgar appetites of the drooling masses, and that dismissed democracy on the basis that if you had a real democracy, even the donkeys would get airs and graces and ideas above their station, basically saying that the demos should be seen in that kind of bracket as beasts of burden. He set the template for those same criticisms of democracy that you can't give the demos power. We're much better off with the rule of a selected, enlightened few. 2,500 years later, we have a very peculiar moment in history, because we have a moment in history where, for the first time ever in Western political history, all political leaders pay lip service to democracy. It's almost unprecedented in the post-Second World War period that that's happened. That it's no longer legitimate to say you don't believe in democracy. Everybody has to pay lip service to it. But at the same time, in practice, they want to limit democracy. We believe in democracy, but not too much. Not something like the Brexit referendum, not something like the election of Trump, not something where democracy goes too far. As John Major, the former Tory Prime Minister, made the point in his disgust at the revolting masses vote in the Brexit referendum, the tyranny of the majority, he said, has never applied in a democracy. Some of us might naively have thought that majority rule was actually the essence of democracy, but not for the political class of today. And so we have an increasingly unrepresentative democratic system. In the name of representative democracy, it's increasingly unrepresentative. More and more power is invested in unaccountable, unelected institutions, courts, commissions, the European Union, and the political class, as we've already heard, it becomes increasingly isolated from the population. And so that's a very long way from where democracy began 2,500 years ago, with direct democracy and citizens' power in ancient Athens. We should always say, by the way, that ancient Athens can hardly be held up as a model of what we're aiming for, because, of course, it was citizens' power as long as you were a male citizen. If you were a slave, or worse yet, a woman, you had no role whatsoever in ancient Athenian democracy. So that should always be borne in mind. But nevertheless, I think the spirit of democracy, of the combining of people and power, is something that has come up time and again in the high points of democratic struggle historically. And it's that spirit that we need to revive and modernise if we're going to have any chance of really reinstituting a democratic system today. We need to find ways to make representative democracy more representative, and reintroduce an element of direct democracy, of more direct control for the people in political life. How that will happen, we'll have to wait and see, because these things are not, contrary to the current wisdom, thought up by wonks in think tanks. They actually happen as a product of real struggle. But the one thing I'd say to end on is that if we want to start by reviving the spirit of democracy, we're going to have to start by pushing through Brexit. Because we can use all the language we like to talk about what democracy might mean. But if we live in a society where 17.4 million people, the largest number of people who have ever voted for anything in British political history, can be ignored, and their expressly and simply stated wishes are derailed, diluted, or rewritten in the way that the political class are trying to do them today, then it doesn't really matter what kind of language we use to describe democracy. Democracy is going to be in a lot more trouble than even we might have imagined it to be. As far as I'm concerned, if we want to talk about reviving the spirit of democracy in our society today, it is Brexit or bust.
So I definitely want to come out to the audience very, very soon. But one thing just to tease out, I mean, when Mick said that sort of everybody uses the language of democracy, like similarly here, like obviously I don't think anybody was going to straight come out and say, no, democracy, terrible idea. But so we've had a lot of sympathetic responses to democracy. So to tease out maybe some of the differences, I just wanted to ask for a quick response on sort of where do we draw the line with democracy? At what point do we say, okay, no, there's no democracy over that? Where do we draw the line between democracy and protecting rights? What sort of things do we say, no, people shouldn't have control over that, or that should be decided by a different kind of process to a democratic process? So again, if I can just start with you.
There is no line. Everything should be democratic. In one way or another. I've seen what we call judicial or processes of criminal justice, which are not necessarily words I would choose, done collectively and democratically by groups of people affected. That is often an activity that is segregated from an appointed and very exclusive elite There is no other area, in my view, whether in the economy or in politics or in social activity, that should not be a shared concern and therefore should not be subject to collective decision-making of one kind or other. And just to comment on what's been said, referendums are not what I mean by direct democracy. I'm talking about the process of constant discussion, participatory democracy, where my compromise today is met by your compromise tomorrow. One-off referendums about single issues does not constitute that. I'm not talking about Brexit. I'm just saying there is a profound misunderstanding of the nature of referendums. This is not what I mean by direct democracy. I'm talking about a constant process of activity where through that activity we actually become citizens. We're not citizens, we are passive, we are subjects. We have allowed ourselves to become a kind of complaining mass, given the right to complain about politicians but not actually practicing it. And it's not implausible that we actually start to practice, and through that practice we reform by our own activity.
Thanks, Ken. And Ali, so on that question of like, where do we draw the line?
Well, look, I mean, I'd like to take it in a slightly different way. We wouldn't have the problem if politicians actually listened to the people. Now, I'm not calling for politicians to simply be delegates. I mean, it goes back to the whole Burkean philosophy of what are elected representatives for? Are they just delegates on behalf of their constituents, just blindly implementing the will of their constituents without thinking, or are they actually representatives that use their own brain and look at things in the round? I still think we should be focused on representative democracy, but there are responsibilities on the part of the political class to understand how far they're going to go away from the actual wishes of the people. And when they do, you end up with a Brexit referendum result, right? So I'm not calling for the fact that they should just simply follow the line all the time that the people want. But if they don't, they do so at their own peril. And I think that if you've got a situation at the moment, I mean, what you have in the discourse at the moment is a very polarized level of debate going on, right? So the politicians are just not listening to the people and giving out their diktats, and the people are hurling abuse back to the political class, and it's pretty vitriolic in some cases, because that's a level that we have descended to. I mean, most of the country is not having debates like we're having here, where we're actually discussing these things in some depth. I mean, you have to watch Question Time nowadays to see that all it is point scoring. It's just such a low level of discourse that we have now in this country. I want to see that elevated, and then we can probably have a discussion about whether the system's working better. Let's make what we have work better.
I suppose this is something I'm still thinking about. I don't have a kind of definitive answer to the question that you've asked. But again, I'm thrown back, as I always am, to the 17th century. So I'm thrown back to the Levellers, who, when thinking about popular power, wanted to distinguish those powers that the people should pass over to Parliament and those powers that the people needed to retain for themselves that they could not pass over to Parliament. And so there was a distinction between some things that it was okay for those representatives to deal with and other things that it was important that were held by the people. And I wonder whether that kind of much more mixed way of thinking about things might provide solutions. And I'm very taken by notions of actual participation. I've had examples of the idea that actually when you put people together and get them to discuss, what happens is that they might start out far away from each other, but in the process of discussion, they come closer together. So actually, I think, echoing both of the previous two speakers, I think discussion, debate is actually perhaps part of the solution. And there may be a much more mixed way of thinking about it rather than saying, all these powers go here and that's the end of it.
Right, and Mick, your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure about the details of how a system might work, but I think as a principle, we have to accept that there is far too little democracy, and democracy ought to be extended into taking decisions about far more important and various issues. But you have to accept that once the democratic genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. And you may not get the result that you wanted from it. But that's the problem, and that's the problem with the discussion of democracy today. Democracy is about choice. That doesn't mean that you get to choose which bits and which results you like, or you can choose which bits you like, not which bits you're prepared to accept or which bits you seek to overthrow. As a principle, democracy, there is far too little of it in our society, and we have to accept that. And I think I am talking about referendums. I don't believe in the Swiss system of having a kind of a banal referendum about almost everything. But I think there are important issues where a referendum and a yes-no referendum actually can bring politics to life. One of the most striking things about the referendum, the reaction to the Brexit referendum was when the Electoral Society did their commission did their survey of result of why people voted in such a way and how people reacted to it. They had to report, and they did so very grudgingly because they hated the Brexit referendum. They had to report very grudgingly that many people had said to them that what they loved about the Brexit referendum, about the debate beforehand and the vote itself, was they felt it was the first time in their lives that their vote actually counted, that it actually mattered. They were engaged in a proper debate about the future of society in which there was no safe seats, there was no wasted votes, every vote mattered. That's a real example of how actually you can bring politics to life. And the Scottish independence referendum had the same effect, I think, really revitalising political debate by giving people the power to make a proper decision. I think that's something that we should really value.
Sure. Ken just wants to come in very, very quickly. But it's,
just very quickly on what Rachel said, which I think is a point of fundamental importance and is widely misunderstood. When people, the empirical evidence of social science, particularly done by a chap called Professor James Fishkin at Stanford University, clearly demonstrates that when people meet in person, not online, to debate differences, they tend to narrow those differences. But there is one very, very important proviso, which is that something has to be at stake. If they're just debating a point about who is right and who is wrong, where there is no consequence to the debate, then polarization is often the result. Somebody wants to win the argument, there is a winner and a loser. When there is a real outcome, say it's the future of your local school or hospital, where something is at stake, then consensus, there is more consensus and less polarization.
I just wanted to ask the panel how they feel bureaucracy limits democracy, because in the USA, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but she wasn't elected, and it's happened before over there. Here we have gerrymandering and like a non-representational system because of seats. And a bit of a smaller example, well maybe bigger, is in Grenfell Tower, the residents weren't able to get their desire to have sprinklers implemented because the referral system to the council is very complicated and it basically goes back to the council. So because of bureaucracy, their well was blocked.
I want to take up Mick's point about Brexit, and 17 million people voted for Brexit, therefore it must go through. It seems to me the problem for democracy here, though, is that 15.5 million people voted against it. So what happens to them? Do they just disappear? Do they just have to crumble? Do they have to give up their long-seated beliefs? That's why I think this notion of participatory democracy that Ross raised, and you took up as well, is absolutely critical. It seems to me if democracy is going to work, it's got to be a live, dynamic process, not something that happens at a moment in time and a small majority win, and then that's solidified forever in a major issue. That is the critical thing. And if we could get, with Brexit, some kind of participatory discussion now to take on board the views of the Remainers as well as the Leavers, then we might get somewhere. Otherwise, I fear we will leave this country horribly and deeply divided for many years.
Just two things on that. Everybody here knows who the President of America is, don't they? But how many people here know what the Premier of Switzerland's called? And there's a reason for that. He's effectively just there to do what he's told. And when you think about democracy being a continuous process, like the man was saying down there, probably, I know you've said a lot against the Swiss system, but it runs really well. And people do quietly make those little decisions about their lives, and they get their consensus going that we all think is good, and there's a really good consocial thing going on there. And too much power is not concentrated in too few pairs of hands. Now, it seems to me that that's actually the essence of democracy. That's where Cleisthenes was coming from. And it's only when too many people get that power and they get their hand on the wheel that it starts going wrong. because then you get what Aristotle was talking about. Because he, of course, asked a very interesting question. He says, people talk about democratic behaviour. Do they mean the kind of behaviour you'd like to see in a democracy, or the kind of behaviour you need to keep one? And it's a very subtle question, but it can make all the difference in the world when stuff's on the line. So maybe what I think we should be doing is kind of learning a bit more from the Swiss, and maybe going back to the Greeks and the original people who put it in there in the first place.
I'd just like to return to this issue of referendum. It does seem to be that there's a kind of a sense on the panel that actually democracy is about kind of fudge, compromise, and you talk about direct democracy as outcome, but isn't that what a referendum is about? Isn't it surely the binary nature that, Ali, you say is rather problematic, is the actual democratic content of democracy? It's binary. It's yes or no. We have a decision. There's no fudge here. There's no manifesto that we can, slippage that we can hide under the carpet. It's actually, the referendum are the closest we have to a participatory democracy. And just to kind of, finally, I live and work in Scotland. Actually, 55% of people in Scotland voted against Scottish independence. The Scots weren't denied independence. They don't want it.
I just wanted to say, for those who are saying we should have more referendums, how do we decide on what goes to a referendum? Do we just have a vote for everything? Secondly, what happens if the democracy then it starts to infringe on the individual? Suppose people vote to outlaw homosexuality. And also, how, if we're going to have more democracy, how do is 50% plus one good enough?
Great, thanks. So I'm going to come back to the panel. I think there's like a bit of a cluster of questions around this idea of, okay, even if we say we really like participatory democracy, at what point do we make decisions? At what point do certain options get closed off? So maybe to hear some on that. I'll go in a sort of reverse order if you could kick us off, Mick.
Well, the point about on the Brexit referendum, for example, is no, if you lose a referendum, you don't give up and sit down and say, well, that's the end of that. Democracy means you carry on fighting for what you believe in. But what it shouldn't mean is you go to court to try and derail it. You try and organise in the House of Lords to derail it through the back door, and you demand a second referendum and presumably a third and a fourth one immediately until you get the result that you want. That's an abuse of the system. But there's no way that Remainers should be denied their voice or have to sit down and take it. The political struggle continues, and the political struggle is continuing. And I can assure you, all of you, anybody who's worried about the Remainers' voice being taken for granted, don't worry about it. The Remainers are running the whole process. And what we are en route for is a form of leaving the EU, which is just remaining under another name. That's the major problem, is that actually what was voted for in that referendum is not what's going to be implemented at all. Every political party is run by Remainers. Even the Labour Party, which is run by Jeremy Corbyn, who's his whole life been a leaver and a follower of Tony Benn, abandoned that principle the one moment it mattered in the referendum and voted Remain, and now says he'd do the same in another one. So I wouldn't worry about Remainers' voice being discounted. It's the leavers who are actually in danger of being isolated. Just one other point about this. There's a lot of talk about, the problem with referendums, the problem with these kind of, I don't want to fetishise referendums, but the problem with these kind of things is that there's divisions and binary, as the last questioner was asking. Divisions are absolutely crucial to democracy. That's what democracy is about, a division, a debate, at which the society comes to decide what it believes on a majority basis. That's the essence of democracy. That's what political parties were formed. When the American Republic started, they thought we won't have political parties, we'll just have a national consensus. Then it became very quickly obvious around debates like the Sedition Acts at the end of the 18th century that there were very different interests and views in politics. They needed parties and division and debate so that people could vote for what they believed in. So we shouldn't, I think, no one was interested in abuse on social media, but we should not in any way be downplaying the importance of division in a way that it's somehow seen as illegitimate. And somehow what we want is a consensus. What we want is a proper, no-holds-barred political debate under the terms of free speech, for which, at the end of which society can decide what it believes to be true.
Great, thanks. And so I'm going to come to Rachel.
I was very taken with the fact that a lot of the questions, as Jacob says, seem to coalesce around the same sorts of things. And in particular, I think this question of division, if you like, not the division, the kind of connection between debate, and there seems to be quite a lot of sense here that we want more of the debate, and action, because of course the problem is that in a democracy you need to have action as well. Things need to be done, and I was struck with the first issue about bureaucracy. It's very easy to say, well, we don't want bureaucracy, we're opposed to bureaucracy, but that is partly about how you actually get things done and how action is taken. And so it seems to me that that's the crux of the problem that really needs to be addressed. How do we, yes, we might want more debate, but how do we move from a position of debate to also making sure that things get done and that there are mechanisms for allowing things to happen as well? And again, I guess it comes back to the issue of there needs to be some agreement about the process by which those decisions are going to be made. So, I think the Swiss example is an interesting one. Is that the way in which we might organise democracy in this country rather than the way in which we do it now? I think that those are issues to be explored, if you like. Referendum might be one way of dealing with certain questions, but there might, I think, be other ways of dealing with other kinds of questions. And I suppose that's what I'm getting at in terms of this notion of maybe a mixed system where different issues, maybe at different political levels, are dealt with in different ways, rather than assuming that one or two systems might be the answer to the whole democracy.
Great, thanks for that. Annie?
Well, I think there is a place for referenda in a representative democracy when you need the people to act as a safety valve on a political class. Now, if you look at Scotland, if you didn't have a referendum, the SNP would have gone for independence unilaterally. The people voted no, as you rightly said. On Brexit, there was no major political party that was in favour of leaving. The people voted to leave. So it's a check on the political class on an issue of major constitutional significance and importance, and therefore there is a place for referenda in that sense. What referenda should not be used for is, and I regard this as an abuse, is as a means to deal with internal divisions within the Tory party. I think it's a disgrace. And I honestly think that the way the whole thing was handled by Cameron was very cack-handed. I mean, you've got a binary yes-no decision, which allows ex post, the referendum ex post, for every single commentator or politician to interpret that result in whatever way they want. So did the people who voted to leave, did they vote to leave the customs union? Did they vote to leave the single market? What did they vote for? I mean, you've got all this. We should have had a multiple choice question. Do you want to leave but remain in the single market? Do you want to leave and remain in customs union? Whatever. It should have been much thought through in much more detail than it was. So it's been badly handled in my view. The other point that was mentioned was about bureaucracy and about the voting system, etc., etc. The worst example of democracy, the worst example of bureaucracy I can see at the moment is the House of Lords. I mean, we lecture the Russians and the Chinese about democracy, and we have a body where you basically have party donors, mates of various prime ministers, and political has-beens sitting in a legislature for life, basically making laws. I don't understand it. And just on the point about voting, very, very briefly. I mean, Blair never won a majority of the popular vote. You have to deal with the system you have. We had a referendum on AV. 67% of the people didn't want it. So we are where we are.
Great, thanks. Go ahead.
It's Carne, by the way.
Oh,
it's fine. I've just returned from living more or less for 20 years in the United States, and one of the very refreshing things about the United States is that nobody really believes they have a democracy. They know it's a kind of facsimile of democracy. And I would suggest that referendums are also a facsimile of democracy. They're a little moment, a little sputter of participation, when in fact we should be participating permanently. We're not, of course, the first people to think about these problems. You read the Federalist Papers, you read Greek philosophy. I refer, one of my favourites is Isaiah Berlin, a refugee from Central Europe, who thought very closely about these issues. And he understood that politics is a process of give and take. You're dealing with the crooked timber of humanity, as he put it, Is give and take intrinsic to referendums? No, of course it's not. And of course the other problem of referendums, and indeed of our own supposed democracy, which is not in fact a democracy, is majoritarianism. It is not a good outcome, and majoritarianism is not what democracy means. It is one definition, but it is a definition that, of course, benefits the majority. If you are a minority, you take people of colour in the United States, or indeed the poor, you know very well that you have no say ever in the political decisions that really affect you. We have to find a way of politics that allows everybody to speak, to be equal in the process, and where those views are respected and there is a process of give and take. Again, this has been thought about very carefully, and one possible model is one where you have local assemblies at the communal level where decisions are made not by majority but by, ideally, consensus, which is not an unfeasible thing. If we had to sit here and talk about the future of the school where our children go to school, and we could only do so to make a decision by consensus, my guess is we probably could reach consensus. It would take us time. It would be a nasty process. There'd be hurt feelings and shouting, but my guess is we could probably do it. Doing it by a majority vote would not be a good outcome. If you keep decision-making at the most local level and you decide that only at the top level will those decisions be administered, not decided, you can actually conserve and produce a system that is genuinely democratic where all people have a voice.
Question to Ali. You sort of talked about the quality of debate on question time. And I kind of wanted to understand where you were going with that point. Because are you saying that people need a bit more education in order to be given political power so that democracy works? Because that seems a bit elitist to me. Because there were similar arguments against giving black people the vote in South Africa on the basis that they needed education.
Great, thanks. So the person next to you.
I just wanted to broaden out a bit more and talk about democracy more generally. And if you want a kind of see what the political class think about people taking democratic decisions and taking things into their own hands, you just have to look at how trade union legislation has changed over the last 20, 30 years and what impact that has had on people. Because, in order to take industrial action now in the workplace, it used to be a relatively straightforward thing. You just have a majority and that was it. Now you have to, not only do you have to give notice that you're going to run a ballot, you have to give them a copy of the ballot paper and go for all these other hurdles. And over the last few years, there's been a continual kind of like, cutting back against, the way in which people are allowed to kind of take democratic decisions themselves. To the extent now, that in some areas, some sectors, you have to have to hit thresholds in terms of number of people of the workforce, number of people in your membership, and hit far more than 50% plus one, in order to get a decision. And that's a result of the political class, cutting back on our democratic ability to decide, what to do, and I think that's been something over the last few years that we've really seen an attack on.
Two naive questions for the panel. Must there be a separation between the process of governing and the process of running for re-election? Seems very strange in this country. Everything goes on hold. You have purdah. You have very odd manifestos written by the likes of Nick Timothy in the small hours of the morning, and then there's an election. If elections were more frequent, as some radicals have suggested in the past, could governing and running for office become either the same thing or at least closer than they are now? My other naive question, the situation in Catalonia, it raises the problem that if an area secedes, then it changes the entity being seceded from, not just the one that is doing the seceding. So who gets a say in that? I'm quite comfortable when it comes to reaching up and looking at the EU and saying, the electorate of the UK has a say in that, and that's that. But when it comes to within the boundaries of a nation or a state, how might we resolve that question? Or does it depend on the history of the region?
I think it's quite interesting, this debate, what is democracy, that a lot of the discussion is very technical. How do you organise this decision? How do you organise people to make this decision or that decision? What is the technical solution for working this through? And to me, that kind of misses the point about what I think democracy is, which I agree, rule of the people. And it's not a technical question, it's a political question. And I think on the referendum, I agree with you when you say Cameron was cowardly to call the referendum. He called the referendum because he didn't know what to do. But he thought he would get the result. He thought it would just be a shoo-in. And it wasn't a shoo-in. Because really what happened through that referendum, which is why I think the content of it is really important, is that families sat down in front of the television and they watched every single debate that went on and they discussed it. They went to the pub, they discussed it with their friends. They thought about it and they decided what they were going to vote for. And the majority of people, like me, decided that they wanted to leave the EU. And it was a very, very serious conversation that the country had. And to me, that, it's not, is it a referendum or not, in many ways. The reason why it was so brilliant, actually, is because it created a conversation, a democratic, political conversation, which is the essence of, you know, then you make a decision as a result of that conversation, and that is the democracy.
I wanted to ask what the relationship between democracy and sovereignty is, because we've talked about quite a lot about what happens within democracies, and I don't think it's just about Brexit, but there's also maybe something to be said about, you know, in the history of certainly the last 50 years, what exactly is it that has been undermined in a democratic way by kind of breaches of sovereignty? Not necessarily in a sense of kind of trying to work out what a remedy might be. Those things are, of course, kind of really political and are themselves the product of international relations in a broader sense. But what exactly is it in democratic life that's threatened by breaches of sovereignty? And what is the relationship kind of between the two?
I understand that the nature of politics is based on promises and campaigns. However, my big issue with Brexit was the outright lies and impossible promises that were made. And that, to me, I would argue, is not very democratic at all.
I agree a lot with what Carne Ross was saying, and particularly on local and economic democracy. But in a world that's rising from 7 to 9 billion people, and with a lot of complex issues like monetary supply, trade rules, who governs the water, how the rules for water and energy and all of that, bikes and cars and all of these complex issues that make up our world today, the question is, where do we start? Because I think we need to go to the world you're describing, but how do we start and move there in a way that we get there fast as possible?
Great,
Where do we start?
So the panel, hopefully just be really, really brief, pick up one thing.
It's impossible to be wholly brief about complex questions. I wrote 70,000 words on this very question that you just asked. To me, you can start at the bottom. There is substantial evidence of Nobel Economics Prize winning Professor Eleanor Ostrom, if you read her work. The sharing and governance of the global commons, of the commons, is actually best achieved through a participatory process, not through a top-down process. And I think you can look at the state of the world's commons to reach a judgment about exactly how well the current system is going. I'm going to focus actually very quickly on Catalonia. I advised the government of Catalonia, the government of Kosovo before they became independent, South Sudan, today Somaliland, the Palestinians, the Sahrawis of the Western Sahara. So I've done a lot of self-determination around the world, and there's an awful lot of confusion about it, not least because states sow that confusion. States don't like self-determination and separatism because turkeys don't like Christmas. We need to find criteria for what is legitimate processes of self-determination. And actually, if we could, embody them in law, though I think because states are in charge of international law, they won't. But to me, those criteria are pretty obvious. They're things like, is this the wish of the democratically expressed wish of the majority? Do they wish to pursue this peacefully and ideally through negotiation? Is there an involvement of a foreign power? Those are three criteria. You could elaborate others. That would mean, for instance, self-determination in East Ukraine is not legitimate, but it is legitimate in Catalonia and in Scotland and indeed in Kosovo. I think framing it as you need to ask the whole country from that which was being seceded from is a recipe for conflict. In South Sudan and Kosovo, and I'm afraid increasingly in Catalonia, the reason the world granted independence and self-determination to those places is because the alternative was far, far worse. It should not require the threat of mass violence for the rights of people to determine their own future to be respected.
Great, thanks.
I just want to pick up the point that the lady made about my views on question time. The point I was making, sorry, I probably didn't articulate it clearly, is the following. I just think when you watch the panelists on a program like Question Time, and it's not confined to that, there's a lot of political point scoring that goes on. There's a lot of party line, blind following that goes on. And there's a lot of soundbite politics. That's just on the part of the politicians to start with. That's why people are so excited about Jeremy Corbyn. You know, and that's why he's got almost 500,000 people to join the Labour Party. I personally think he's crazy, but that's not the point. He's actually doing very well because he's authentic. Same with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Everyone's excited over the summer about Jacob, our saviour, you know, coming along because he's authentic. So that's on the part of the politicians. People want to see some authenticity, not just blind party line following. The point on the public vis-a-vis the politicians that I was trying to make is not a point about education. I mean, Blair and Cameron were both educated at Oxford. One took us to a war in Iraq, the other one gave us a cack-handed referendum. It's not about education. It's about the discourse and how it is actually conducted. So if one's just hurling vitriolic abuse at politicians, however much one might think they deserve it, it doesn't really get us anywhere. What we should be trying to engage in is a respectful discourse where different points of view are listened to and debated, and you don't just simply brand people who disagree with you as sexist, racist, misogynistic, or whatever it may be, which seems to be the current way we conduct politics in this country. If someone says something you disagree with, you just try and shut down the debate by branding them as something that's just offensive. Just saying, oh, you offend my views, I'm not going to hear from you. That's not the way we have a mature debate in this country, and that's why we end up with increasing polarization and frustration that people feel that they're not listened to.
Great, thanks, Rachel.
I want to pick up on this question of the issue of governing versus re-election that I think the guy here asked, because given that I'm giving the historical view, I'm going back again. The notion of rotation of office that I mentioned, actually there's another element to that, which is the argument is you don't re-elect everybody at once because that creates this sudden hiatus in the system. What you do is you have elections once every year, but you replace 1/3 of the group each year. So you've got a kind of continuity. And the idea... the other thing that I think that also does, and that's something that we haven't really talked about, but potentially also an issue with democracy, and it perhaps comes to the issue that the lady here raised about promises and then promises being broken, that it encourages a longer term perspective, because there's not this, well, we're in for this short period of time and that's the end of it. You've got some level of continuity in that system, and the idea that there are always some people who are looking further ahead than simply, just the next election, if you like.
Great, thanks, Mick.
Just on that point, I think it's very interesting that when we talk about, the great democratic tradition in Britain, we're very complacent about it and everything, that we look back to the Levellers and the Chartists, all of whom were several centuries ago demanding annual parliaments. And we're still a very long way away from having anything like that in terms of the democratisation of our system. So it's worth bearing that in mind, a bit of historical perspective. I want to make a point about the sovereignty and democracy issues. I think it's very important. I'm an old Marxist internationalist and an anti-imperialist. I've always wanted to see an international brotherhood of humanity. But I have become increasingly aware of the importance of defending national sovereignty, particularly against the EU in our circumstances, as the absolute bedrock of democracy. The problem is that there has never been developed a system of democracy which is not based on the nation state, which goes beyond a nation state. Any talk of global democracy, which sounds like a great idea, means in practice that the world is run either by the United Nations Security Council or by the EU taking over and governance in dissident European nations, or some NGOs, self-appointed NGOs, running countries in Africa in the name of global democracy and people power. The only base in which you ever managed to succeed in democracy is the nation state. So I think that's why I've become increasingly aware of the need to defend national sovereignty, which is not the same thing as defending nationalism and land of hope and glory or any of that. But it's saying that if we want to have a democratic debate about something like immigration, which I'm a pro-immigration man, but I think there's a need to for Britain to have control of its own borders and then have a democratic debate about what kind of immigration policy we want to have, rather than having an immigration policy which is imposed via the EU, which can only lead to far more poisonous politics.
Well, I was going to ask about parties and democracy, because unlike the German Democratic Republic, another example of a republic which called itself democratic but wasn't democratic at all, we do have several parties to choose from, and yet we don't have a choice. So I think the EU is a good example. Now, I don't come from this country. I thought Brexit was great because the country where I come from, which is Germany, we have about 6 parties we can choose from. None of them opt to leave the EU. None of them would even question the euro. And that does not reflect people's opinions nor people's wills. So people don't have the chance in a democratic election to vote on an issue which might be important to them. The same thing would go for immigration and for a load of other topics. So that is just my question. So what do we do about that? You know, the breakdown of the party system.
I think I noticed that there are no MPs at this particular battle of ideas. There was one Conservative MP last year on one of the panels. There might have been one a couple of years back. My MP, my local MP, who's on the front bench, Paul Blomfield, a very nice guy. He's conscientious. He has a meeting every year with his constituents, but he doesn't know very much. It's amazing what he doesn't know. He doesn't know about our GDP. He doesn't know what proportion of immigrants haven't got any skills. He doesn't know any. He can't discuss the headscarf of Muslim girls, and so on and so on. He can't discuss population. It's very evident that MPs are not interested in learning these kinds of things. I noticed that they're on Twitter, but they're not on YouTube.
Okay, Mick briefly alluded to this. One area where the idea of participatory democracy that Carne mentioned is really well developed for many, many decades now is in thinking about development, rural development in the developing world, where you can see people have a sort of direct stake over local resources and so on. And, you know, this has been a kind of staple of development thought. What it does, though, it kind of reduces people's agency, if you like, or their capacity to be actors and control over their own lives to local concerns. And very often it undercuts their capacity to be actors and have a say over their future in relation to national concerns. And I think, as Carne, you drew a false counter-position, really, between the idea of this sort of constant local democracy over things at stake and referenda. Because the whole point about a referenda, and I think Brexit is a very, very good example of it, regardless of what people think about the result of it, is that it involved people as agents over society's resources, not local resources, not immediate questions, but about political direction. I think somebody mentioned already that the kind of political question at stake here. So it's really, really important not to counterpose that. People exist locally and want control over local things, but they want control over national things too, and global things, and maybe wider political change beyond that too.
There's been a lot of talk about a return to Athenian democracy, but one thing that occurred to me is that the way that we engage with the world now, I mean, it's rapidly changed. It's a sort of, it's become an increasingly mediated world, and there are kind of entities that didn't really exist before in Athenian times. So that's my first question. And my second question related to that is there's been a lot of talk about the political class, but not much about part of the bedrock supporting that class, which is, big corporations, technology moguls and media moguls. And I just wanted to, it strikes me that some of those big corporations might not really be very supportive of direct democracy.
Yeah, I'm just responding to something you said. I was thinking about, it struck me as deeply true that Greece is the wheels of democracy is free speech, right? So, you talk about systems and stuff. I mean, democracy is a flawed system, but it's the best flawed system we've yet found. So I think we mess with it at our peril. So, but you want to take home point that I can take home to my small life. And I guess that is that it's easier said than done, but if any one system, government, social situation tries to shut me up or anyone up, just refuse. That's it.
Great, thanks.
I don't think the panel's answered one of the points or questions that was raised earlier about the issue of, I think somebody said, what if people voted against homosexuality? And I think this raises a really interesting thing, because what we hear about when people support democracy, we normally hear that people are happy with democracy when the demos votes in favour of things that they believe in. But when there's something which is brought up, which is, I think we've heard it, I heard it somewhere, you don't want to put the issue of capital punishment to the vote, because we know what those awful people would vote. So I think that's quite an interesting thing about it, particularly at the moment in the light of the Brexit vote. There's the view that the people, that they made the wrong decision. So I'd like to comment on that.
It just comes back to a really basic point around majoritarian democracy. If democracy doesn't involve a majority of the people, it's not democracy. And I think there's a real... one of the key ways that democracy has been diluted today is the sneering at majoritarian democracy. You know, read any academic textbook on majoritarian democracy, and the very language of diluting majoritarian democracy is in the language of participatory democracy or deliberative democracy. But it seems to me that majoritarian democracy was rather good in South Africa. And I think we're sort of forgetting the basics of democracy involves persuading the majority of people. And if we lose that, if we attack the idea that the majority shouldn't decide things, we're going back to elite forms of politics.
Thank you. I wanted to get back to the issue of education that was raised briefly in a dialogue between Ali and a lady there, and to suggest that education is a right of citizenship. I felt that it was dismissed as perhaps not being relevant, or that to talk about education is being elitist. That surely is wrong. I mean, education must be a necessary part of the constitution of a democratic society, and we can have a democratic society because people are educated, not in spite of it. Thank you.
Does anybody think that society should somehow see that everybody does use their vote? Because when we talk about the majority and the number of people that voted for Brexit is, for example, it might have been the majority of the people that voted, but it's not the majority of the people in the country. So there are things that the government does really, in fairness, that stops people from voting, like maybe people can't get off work, maybe they can't get a babysitter, maybe, like maybe people should be required to get it should be a national holiday. And people are actually paid the same, and they're to enable or even in some ways to require, whether anybody thinks it's a good idea, that people should be not necessarily forced, but I don't know, maybe, just a question. Yeah.
I would say I think it's a mistake to see the nation state as the sole repository of democracy. Democracy has existed and flourished in villages, in cities, in tribes, in regions, and of course in nations. That doesn't answer the question, though, what do we do about these bigger global questions, the commons, the national questions? The gentleman at the back raised a very good point. If you're preoccupied with local issues, how do you have agency on the national? How do you talk about things at scale? There are answers to this. Confederation is one answer to this, the aggregation of local views, where the national view or the supranational view is only administering the collective view. But there are also answers which are evident today, and a good comparison would be something like the Global Fund for AIDS, where NGOs, companies, the private sector, civil society take their seats on equal terms with governments. And I see that partly as a product of the battle for the rights of patients and victims of AIDS to be heard in the consideration of their own treatment. And I see the answer in all of these things, if I can offer a simple answer, as being about participation of the people affected. We can't necessarily have a perfect deliberative system all the way up through every level. And I'm afraid I won't concede that majoritarianism is a bad thing. Nobody's saying that we don't sometimes need majority decisions. Of course you need to in order to make decisions, and nobody's saying that the majority in South Africa should have been ignored. But I'm simply saying we should strive for a system where all are able to speak on equal terms, and where consensus is promoted as much as possible and not demoted as a goal. My final point would be about the political bubble, the media class, this group of people. I never quite know who they are. I sometimes worry that I'm one of them. But it's a debate that's also happened in America post-Trump, which is that the Democratic Party has lost its way in what is called in America identity politics, sometimes called political correctness. I do think it's very necessary to remember that the desire to eradicate homophobic, misogynist, racist language from the political discourse is a desire to include groups of people who have been historically excluded and marginalized in political debate. And I would very much hope we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Of course, we want robust, contrarian debate, as our friend Christopher Hitchens would have argued for. But in that, there must be respect for all groups and facilitation of groups who have historically been marginalized to participate on equal terms. We are a very, very long way from that.
Thanks a lot. Right.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the word contrarian, because I found it a prize for people who stand up for their views and take contrarian positions. Just on your point, sir, that you mentioned, why do we not see many politicians here? Because they're so dull. I mean, you know, I stood for Parliament twice. I mean, you think, well, if there were more independent-minded MPs, and the reason why you don't have this now is because we've seen the rise of a political class. Just think back over the last 20 years. The Miliband brothers, Osborne, Cameron, Clegg, all party apparatchiks, all straight to their party HQs, all straight to safe seats, running the country. I mean, never done a real job. So no wonder no wonder they're not invited here. Claire Fox and these guys are sensible. I would say, just in terms of choice in politics, there's been real bland managerialism over the last couple of decades. You know, Blair, Cameron, you know, not much to choose between the two. However, you know, UKIP in the European elections a few years back topped the poll. So there was a choice. There was a choice, and Farage, he's always vilified. He's a really divisive figure, and a lot of people hate the guy. He played a massive part in the debate and won the debate. So there is a choice. It's just depending on, you know, if you really want to vote for it or not. The final point I would say is about this compulsory voting point that you made. I wouldn't opt for compulsory voting. But, you know, having stood for Parliament twice, and when you knock on the doors and you're canvassing, and people go, you say, look, you know, will you be voting? And, I can't be bothered. Well, you know, well, then you're a freaking idiot, basically. Because you should get off your backside and do it, right? So the young people who actually got together now and, you know, who have voted in the election, good. A lot of them were sleeping during the referendum. That was not helpful. People should get engaged. You have got a voice, because if you don't vote, you can't influence the outcome. So there's no point complaining about it. There will be sometimes circumstances where people will have unforeseen issues that arise and they can't go on voting day. But you've got postal vote. You've got other ways of doing it. So I think those are really few and far between. So anyone who doesn't vote should frankly be ashamed of themselves.
Great, thanks. Rachel.
I think it's a shame that we've only got a little bit of time left, because I do feel as though there have been some fantastic questions raised, and it would be nice actually to sit here for the rest of the afternoon and to continue to discuss some of them. So what I'm going to say is kind of premised on that. But I felt in that context it was very important, since it's now been asked twice, and since I thought it was an important question both times, to come back to this question of what do you do when democracy potentially infringes, or when a majority decision could potentially infringe individual rights? And the example of voting against homosexuality being illegal being the example that was raised. And I do think that's a really important question, important issue for us to think about. Again, I talked a little bit earlier about the levellers. Again, this was part of the reason, I think, behind their notion that there are certain rights that you give to your representatives and certain rights that you hold for yourself. And one of the rights, obviously, it's a very different age, and I think the point made about times being different is also important. But of course, for them, that kind of issue of the individual's right was largely related to religion and religious belief. And one of the powers that was to be held by the people rather than being transferred to their representatives was that right about religious conscience and what you believed. It was up to the individual to make that decision rather than some representative imposing it on them. So there is a model there. It doesn't solve the problem, because what we also know from the 17th century is that for most people at the time, there were what were deemed to be acceptable religious beliefs and others that were deemed to be unacceptable. So it doesn't solve the problem. But maybe thinking in that way perhaps provides an answer to what I think is a really troubling, problematic issue.
Great, thanks. And then finally, to close, Mick.
Thank you. Yes, far too many questions, very interesting questions. Sorry, we haven't been able to discuss them all properly. A couple of quick points. I agree that there's, however many parties there might be in our society today, there's very little political choice. That's most dramatically illustrated, as many things are, by the Brexit issue, where despite the Leavers winning the referendum, every party in the UK Parliament is led by people who campaigned for and voted to remain, with the exception of the unpopular and unrepresentative, we're always told, DUP in Northern Ireland. Every other party in Parliament is led by people who campaigned for and voted for remain. That's a huge gap between the people. But I would think we need to have a fundamental realignment of political parties in this country. You know, they all need to break up and realign, forget about the old right-left divide. Let's have some proper realignment around which side you're on the key issues like democracy and freedom of speech in our society. I want to say I think there's a false dichotomy that's been created, and it often is in these discussions, between majority democracy and minority rights. And the idea that if you allow the majority to have a say, that they'll trample all over minority rights. Actually, minority rights have been won in the context of the struggle for democracy. They're not gifts handed out by a few elitist judges or experts. They've actually been won as a part of the struggle for popular democracy, and that is the way they are best defended. I would far rather trust the masses on those matters than a few judges or experts or anybody else to hand down rights as if it's a kind of an act of charity from above. And I think the trust, who you trust in politics, is the end question about democracy. Now, I actually think the 21st century we ought to trust the mass of the people. That's why I don't believe that Brexit was won because of lies, or that Trump was elected because of the Russians, or any of these other attempts to find some excuse for why you didn't get the result that you wanted in an election. I think we've fundamentally got to trust the masses, and we've got to find some way to put the demos back at the centre of democracy. And I think, you know, that doesn't mean recreating Athenian democracy on the 2,500-year-old model. Even Tom Paine made the point that it would be a very sorry situation if we had to go back to Athens to find our way of government. It means recreating a spirit of popular democracy in the first instance, and recognising that we need to fight for democracy and expanding democracy and free speech as fundamentals. Because whatever problems there might be with democracy and with free speech, and there are many, there is always one thing worse, and that's the alternative, the opposite.